The sky above the war-torn planet was a churning mass of gray clouds, streaked with lightning that illuminated the jagged ruins of what had once been proud cities. Smoke rose from shattered battlefields where the remnants of Imperial Guard regiments and orc mobs had clashed in a brutal, chaotic frenzy. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood, ozone from energy weapons, and the faint, unsettling hum of psychic disturbances from the warp that had begun to leak unpredictably through reality. Soldiers and survivors alike moved cautiously, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon, wary of ambushes and sudden eruptions of violence. There was an unspoken tension in every footstep, every whispered command, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the ground began to tremble, not with the footsteps of titans or the roar of battle engines, but with something far heavier, something that seemed almost impossibly dense and powerful. At first, it was a low, rumbling vibration that could be felt through the soles of boots and the metal plating of armored vehicles. But the vibration intensified rapidly, echoing across the shattered plains, rattling the very foundations of buildings that had survived bombardments and last cannons alike. Soldiers turned their heads toward the source of the disturbance, some gripping their weapons tighter, others stepping back instinctively as an unidentifiable fear crept up their spines. A ripple of air, almost imperceptible at first, spread out across the battlefield, disturbing clouds of dust and ash, and carrying with it a strange, acrid scent. It was unlike anything the survivors had ever smelled: hot metal mixed with ozone, scorched earth, and something primal. Some whispered that the air itself had a taste of rage, as if it were infused with pure, unrelenting fury. Psychers felt it immediately, a sharp twist in their minds that made their teeth ache and their skulls pound. The warp itself seemed to shiver and recoil, as if recognizing a force it had never encountered before, something unbound, unpredictable, and immensely strong. From beyond a ridge, a figure emerged, massive and glowing faintly in the dim light of the storm. At first, the outline was almost impossible to comprehend. It was a humanoid shape, but the proportions were grotesquely exaggerated, each muscle coiled and tense with barely contained power. The figure moved with a surprising grace for its size, each step cracking the ground beneath it, sending shards of stone and debris flying. The sky above seemed to respond to its presence. Clouds twisted unnaturally, lightning forked erratically across the horizon, and distant thunder rolled with an almost sentient timing, echoing the rhythm of its approach. Soldiers froze where they stood. Even veteran space marines, accustomed to facing horrors beyond imagination, felt a hesitation, a rare moment where instinct screamed caution over duty. There was something not merely terrifying about this being, but fundamentally alien in its raw presence. Its skin, a deep crimson, seemed to absorb light and then emit it back as a faint, unsettling glow, making every movement appear almost liquid in its intensity. Its eyes burned with a focused, smoldering rage, scanning the battlefield with an intelligence and intent that seemed disturbingly human, yet entirely otherworldly. The remnants of the Imperial Guard attempted to form ranks, shouting orders that trembled in their own mouths. "Hold! Line! Don't!" The words faltered as the ground heaved violently again, sending unsteady soldiers sprawling. Heavy bolters and lasguns discharged in nervous bursts, but the figure did not flinch. Each shot that impacted against him seemed almost irrelevant, absorbed by muscles so dense and power so overwhelming that even plasma fire sizzled harmlessly against his form. Some of the men whispered frantic prayers to the Emperor, but the figure neither acknowledged nor responded, and yet every instinct told them he was aware of them. The warp around the battlefield responded violently to his presence. Psychic signatures twisted and wavered, some exploding outward in bursts of uncontrolled energy, others retreating, leaving gaps in the psychic currents where demons had been poised to strike. Chaos cultists nearby fell to their knees, mouths moving in frantic, incomprehensible incantations as they tried to reach whatever dark patrons could influence the unfolding moment, yet their effort seemed absurdly inadequate. Something about this being disrupted even the most malevolent intentions, as if it were a force that the warp itself struggled to categorize. As the figure continued forward, the environment itself seemed to bend to its steps. Trees that had survived countless orc raids snapped like twigs underfoot. Rivers of molten metal from damaged industrial complexes boiled and evaporated as he passed. Buildings groaned under unseen pressures, walls cracking and shattering without any direct contact. Even the ground bore the imprint of immense force. Soil compressed into ridges and craters forming with each deliberate step. Every motion suggested the kind of controlled violence that could reduce armies to ash and legends to myth. From his stance, even without any overt attack, the battlefield felt as if it was under siege. Units that had moments before clashed violently with one another now hesitated, unsure whether to fight each other or the unstoppable newcomer. The figure paused at the center of the open plain, and the wind seemed to shift violently around him, carrying the scent of iron, fire, and raw, simmering rage. It was a presence that demanded recognition, a force of nature in the truest sense, indifferent to allegiance, unconcerned with strategy, and utterly aware of its own dominance. The first act of violence came not from him, but from the natural world responding to him. Lightning struck erratically, trees splintered, and distant hills cracked as the sheer force of his approach reverberated across the landscape. Soldiers instinctively ducked or braced themselves, expecting that the figure might unleash destruction any moment. But for now, he simply surveyed the battlefield, each exhalation a hiss of power, each motion a quiet declaration that the order of this world was about to be irrevocably challenged. Every observer, from psychers to space marines to terrified survivors, felt an internal recognition of inevitability. The sheer scale, the unrelenting intensity, and the concentrated rage emanating from this figure marked him as an anomaly, an entity that existed outside conventional understanding of strength and power. Even in the midst of Warhammer 40K's endless carnage, where unimaginable horrors are commonplace, the presence of this being inspired a rare and primal kind of awe, mingled with dread. The battlefield fell into a tense, anticipatory silence, punctuated only by the occasional crack of energy weapons or distant explosions. It was a pause that felt impossibly long, stretched by the sheer magnitude of what was happening. Soldiers, demons, and even the environment itself seemed to be waiting for the inevitable eruption of violence that would follow. The figure stood at the edge of the battlefield, crimson skin gleaming faintly, muscles coiled like springs, eyes burning with a silent fury, as though he had already judged everything in sight and found it lacking. Every living being within sight of him could feel it, the raw, almost unbearable intensity of power that radiated outward. There was no need for words, no need for action. The presence alone conveyed a message, one of domination, unbridled rage, and an unstoppable will. Even as bolts of energy arced harmlessly around him, even as titans and war engines rumbled toward him, the figure remained immovable, a living embodiment of destruction poised at the very edge of war. The air itself seemed to quiver with anticipation, the storm above reacting as if in recognition, lightning illuminating his form in jagged bursts that cast long, ominous shadows across the battlefield. Soldiers whispered frantic prayers, space marines adjusted their stances, and psychers strained against the psychic pressure, all united in a singular understanding. Something unprecedented had arrived, something that had the potential to change the outcome of the war before a single blow had even been struck. The ground trembled again more violently this time, and a low, rumbling growl enunciated from the figure, resonating with the natural and unnatural energies around him. Every creature within several kilometers felt the vibration, a visceral warning that whatever was coming would not be fought with conventional means. The battlefield seemed suspended in a moment of pure tension, the calm before an unimaginable storm, with every eye fixed on the Crimson Colossus, who arrived with the certainty of devastation written into his very form.
The Imperium's forces froze in shock, their disciplined formations unraveling under a weightless sense of dread that no battlefield drill could prepare them for. Veteran Space Marines, battle-hardened from centuries of unending war against the galaxy's most horrific threats, found themselves momentarily paralyzed. Their instincts screamed at them to advance, to fire, to act, yet every fiber of their being recoiled from the sheer intensity of what they were witnessing. The crimson figure that had emerged on the horizon was unlike anything recorded in the histories of the Imperium, a being whose sheer presence seemed to warp reality itself, bending the perception of soldiers and commanders alike. Bolter barrels wavered in trembling hands, eyes darted, searching for vulnerabilities that did not exist, and some warriors even whispered prayers to the Emperor with unsteady voices, hoping for protection from an entity that did not respond to faith or allegiance. The shock was immediate and overwhelming. Commanders barked orders, attempting to restore discipline, to rally the troops, to focus them on the tactical necessities of the battlefield. Yet their voices seemed muted against the oppressive weight of the figure's presence. Each shouted command was drowned in the unspoken recognition of impossibility. There was a momentary, almost tangible sense that time itself had slowed, each heartbeat dragging like a chain across the battlefield, as soldiers and commanders alike struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. Even the machinery of war, tanks, artillery, and Titan-class walkers hesitated in motion, their operators instinctively sensing a threat that could not be met with conventional firepower. The psychic pressure was palpable. Psychers stationed at the rear of the formations experienced sharp, stabbing waves of anxiety that clawed at the edges of their minds. Their visions, trained to interpret the chaotic ebb and flow of the warp, now filled with an unrelenting sense of danger and unknown power. Those sensitive to psychic currents felt the warp itself shift and recoil, as if the very fabric of reality was struggling to accommodate the intruder. The presence of this being disrupted centuries of accumulated knowledge about the interaction between matter, energy, and psychic influence. It was as if every rule the Imperium had learned about warfare and survival in a galaxy of horrors had been rewritten in an instant. Soldiers in the front lines felt their instincts betray them. They gripped their weapons tighter, knuckles white, but a deep, unidentifiable fear crept into their bones. Even the most experienced guardsmen, who had survived countless engagements with orcs, tyrannids, and heretical cults, faltered under the weight of uncertainty. Every instinct told them to attack, to hold the line, to follow orders, yet the presence of this figure made their actions feel meaningless. It was not simply fear of death. It was the recognition of a power that could render tactics, formations, and strategy irrelevant. The battlefield had shifted from a contest of military might to a stage dominated by a singular, unstoppable force. The Space Marine librarians and chaplains at the forefront attempted to marshal the minds of their brothers, chanting prayers and psychic wards in an effort to steel them against the growing dread. Their voices resonated with power, echoing across the battlefield, yet even these rituals seemed to falter against the sheer intensity of the figure's aura. Some Marines faltered, caught in brief, paralyzing visions of their own mortality, the galaxy collapsing into fire and chaos. These were not dreams, not illusions, but a psychic impression of raw, unfiltered power that exceeded comprehension. The very air seemed to hum with tension, vibrating against armor and flesh alike, as if the battlefield itself had recognized an intruder whose presence demanded acknowledgement above all else. Heavy war machines, whose crews had been trained for unyielding combat against the universe's most nightmarish foes, now hesitated. Leman Russ tanks ground to a halt. Titans idled mid-step, their massive weapon systems recalibrating as though uncertain of how to engage a target that defied conventional categorization. Even the guns of orbiting void ships, which could lay entire continents to waste with precision bombardments, seemed insignificant in the presence of this entity. Engineers and gunners whispered among themselves, their words trembling with disbelief, trying to find any precedent for the situation unfolding before them, yet there was none. The Imperium had faced gods, demons, and the horrors of the warp, but this was something different, something that existed outside the natural order of war and power. The soldiers' shock manifested physically as well as mentally. Their movements slowed, reflexes dulled by an instinctive understanding that conventional reactions would be insufficient. Communications faltered as Vox channels emitted static, interrupted by bursts of interference, whether caused by the raw psychic energy surrounding the figure or by the overwhelming intensity of his presence. Orders intended to coordinate counterattacks became garbled, and for a moment chaos reigned not from the enemy, but from the soldiers' own inability to act coherently. The sight of a single towering crimson figure had frozen entire regiments in place, halting the machinery of the Imperium's carefully constructed military power in a way no weapon or strategy ever could. Chaos cultists and heretical forces nearby felt the effect immediately. Many of them had come to the battlefield with confidence, expecting to exploit the Imperium's presence for their own ends, but the figures disrupted their plans, instilling a sudden irrational dread. They crouched behind rubble and overturned machinery, uncertain if they were safe, uncertain even of their own intentions. The unnatural aura emanating from him made their dark incantations falter, their demonic allies hesitate, and the previously clear lines of loyalty and obedience dissolve in the face of raw, unfiltered power. Even the natural environment seemed to register the figure's dominance. Trees, already scarred by artillery fire and flame, bent slightly away as if repelled by some unseen force. Dust swirled in spirals around his massive form, and distant mountains seemed to quiver as though recognizing the unnatural intensity of his presence. Soldiers who tried to continue moving forward felt an invisible weight pressing against them, slowing their progress and heightening their awareness of the futility of normal action. The world itself, from the smallest insect to the largest war machine, responded with a subtle, instinctive caution that mirrored the human shock gripping the Imperium's forces. Time seemed to stretch for those witnessing him, each second filled with the oppressive realization that no amount of preparation or valor could guarantee survival. Even the most disciplined veterans found their thoughts clouded, their ability to calculate probabilities overwhelmed by the undeniable fact that their conventional understanding of power in combat was no longer sufficient. Every breath drawn, every heartbeat carried the weight of impending confrontation, and yet nothing had yet been attempted. It was a silence that screamed, a pause filled with tension that gnawed at courage and filled the mind with endless possibilities of devastation. Across the battlefield, some soldiers instinctively lowered their weapons, not in surrender, but in disbelief, as if acknowledging that the force before them was beyond any category they had ever been taught to confront. Officers barked frantic commands, but the words lacked conviction, overshadowed by the shared recognition of impossibility. Even in the disciplined ranks of the Adeptus Astartes, where fear is meticulously trained out and bravery forged through centuries of indoctrination, hesitation flickered like a shadow. The universe itself seemed to lean in, holding its breath, as the Imperium's forces stood immobilized, caught in a moment of awe, disbelief, and unspoken terror.
A warp storm, already violent and unpredictable in this sector of space, began to react in a way no psyker or astropath had ever recorded before. Twisting and convulsing with a frenzy that mirrored the raw intensity of the newcomer's presence. At first, it was subtle, a ripple across the psychic currents, a faint distortion in the Immaterium that only the most sensitive psychers could detect. But within moments, the subtle disturbances amplified into full-blown chaos. Lightning-like tendrils of pure psychic energy leapt erratically across the skies, and the swirling maelstrom above the planet's surface began to take on shapes that defied comprehension, writhing as though alive, as if the storm itself were struggling to contain or resist the force that had intruded into its domain. Psychers stationed on orbital platforms felt a sudden piercing pressure against their minds, a psychic backlash that made their teeth ache and their vision blur. Some screamed involuntarily, clutching at their heads as the warp twisted and shivered around them. Others fell to their knees, overwhelmed by a sense of vertigo that seemed to pull them simultaneously in every direction. Even the most experienced librarians of the Adeptus Astartes, trained to navigate the tumultuous seas of the warp, were forced to concentrate with every ounce of willpower just to maintain control over their minds. The Immaterium itself seemed to be reacting instinctively to the presence of the Crimson Giant, as if some ancient unspoken law of the universe recognized him as an anomaly that could not be ignored. Demons, entities born of raw emotion and psychic energy, sensed the disturbance and hesitated in their movements. Bloodthirsty Khorne berserkers, who normally surged into combat without hesitation, slowed their advance, ears flicking as though detecting some inaudible signal of danger. Slaaneshi's temptresses and seductive horrors twitched unnaturally, their senses unable to predict or understand the strange, overpowering force that had manifested in the material realm. Nurgle's Rotbringers paused mid-step, their diseased forms shivering as if aware of a force that could obliterate even their unnatural resilience. Tzeentchian horrors, normally analytical and calculating, recoiled in their incomprehensible ways, unable to adapt their schemes quickly enough to account for an entity whose power was not just physical, but fundamental, a disruption of the very patterns they sought to manipulate. The warp storm began to escalate, responding almost as though in anger to the presence of the newcomer. Electrical arcs leapt downward from the swirling maelstrom above the planet's surface, striking the planet in violent, unpredictable bursts. Rivers of molten psychic energy surged outward, colliding with one another to form jagged, shimmering walls of raw power.
The clouds themselves twisted into impossible geometries, folding and stretching across the sky in patterns that defied Euclidean understanding. Sailors aboard orbiting ships reported seeing visions of impossible landscapes, glimpses of alien geometries that threatened to shatter the sanity of those who looked too long. It was as if the storm itself were a sentient entity, reacting with fear, aggression, and awe to the mere presence of the crimson figure now advancing across the surface below. Even the physical world felt the influence of the warp's convulsions. Lightning struck metal structures, igniting fires and sending shards of molten metal raining down across the battlefield. The air shimmered with heat and energy, carrying a faint, acrid scent that burned the lungs of all who inhaled it. Trees splintered under bursts of concentrated psychic lightning, and rivers boiled as unseen currents of energy surged through them. The ground trembled and cracked, both from the figure's steps and from the surging storm above, creating fissures that swallowed the bodies of the unfortunate or sent them tumbling helplessly into darkness. It was a chaotic ballet of destruction, an intricate and terrifying dance between reality and the Immaterium, each reacting violently to the other, and both entirely dominated by the crimson interloper. Commanders of the Imperium tried to regain composure, issuing orders to stabilize formations and coordinate counterattacks, but their voices were drowned in the roar of the storm. Communication channels were overloaded with interference, vox signals crackling with static and bursts of incomprehensible sound, as if the warp itself sought to prevent organization and strategy. Soldiers, psychers, and mechanized units alike struggled to maintain cohesion as the natural and psychic environment around them became increasingly unpredictable. Even the most disciplined regiments felt their instincts betray them, caught between the orders of their superiors and the primal instinct of self-preservation that screamed to flee or hide from an incomprehensible power. From his position at the forefront of the battlefield, the crimson figure seemed unaffected by the turmoil around him. His movements were deliberate, measured, and yet filled with an intensity that belied any ordinary understanding of physical or psychic force. Each step sent a shockwave through the ground, amplifying the warp storm's already chaotic responses. Lightning and psychic energy arced toward him, drawn as if by an unseen magnet, only to scatter harmlessly around him, leaving him untouched. The storm's fury seemed almost directed at him, an instinctive recognition that this being represented a force capable of challenging the natural order of both matter and spirit. Onlookers, from Imperial Guard to Space Marines and even rogue psychers, could feel the psychic pressure in ways that were profoundly unsettling. Thoughts became harder to focus, memories flickered, and the simplest calculations became burdensome. Fear, confusion, and awe blended into a singular, almost physical weight pressing against every mind. For many, it was not just fear of physical harm. It was a recognition that this figure represented a disruption of reality itself, an entity whose presence could twist or break both the material and immaterial layers of existence with nothing more than sheer intent. The warp storm continued to escalate, growing taller, more turbulent, and more unpredictable as the crimson figure advanced across the battlefield. The sky itself seemed alive, roiling with an almost sentient anger, and the sounds of distant thunder merged with psychic screams that no human ear could properly register. Every explosion, every bolt of energy, every shift in the wind felt magnified, reacting to the storm's frenzy, feeding it, and in turn reacting to it in ways that created a feedback loop of chaos. This was not merely weather or a simple psychic disturbance. It was an active, reactive force of nature, amplified by the presence of a being whose power the Immaterium could neither predict nor suppress. Even demonic forces, which had thrived on centuries of conflict and the manipulation of the warp, seemed to hesitate in the face of this phenomenon. Their normally reckless aggression was tempered by instinctive caution, a recognition that the crimson figure had an influence over reality and the Immaterium that transcended simple combat ability. Tentacles of raw energy erupted unpredictably. Buildings and terrain were twisted into impossible forms, and psychic echoes of past wars and battles seemed to overlay themselves upon the present, creating a kaleidoscope of temporal and spatial distortion. The soldiers of the Imperium, watching all of this unfold, felt a mounting terror, a pressure that went beyond simple fear of death. This was the weight of witnessing something that challenged the fundamental rules they had lived by, the psychic signature of a being whose presence alone could warp the very battlefield, reshape the psychic landscape, and disrupt even the most disciplined formations. The warp storm above them raged in harmony with this realization, convulsing violently, sending arcs of psychic lightning toward the horizon and filling the air with a tangible sense of impending cataclysm.
Chaos Daemons, usually fearless and unrelenting in their pursuit of carnage and corruption, suddenly hesitated, their movements faltering as if some unseen barrier had intruded upon their instincts. They had been drawn to the battlefield by the promise of slaughter, reveling in the psychic resonance of war, blood, and suffering that permeated the air. Their eyes glowed with malevolent intent, claws and talons poised to rend flesh, teeth bared in anticipation of the next kill. Yet as the massive crimson figure advanced, their aggression faltered. It was not that they were afraid in a conventional sense. Fear was a human weakness, and Daemons transcended such limitations. But the aura emanating from this being was fundamentally incompatible with their existence. It disrupted their connection to the warp, creating a psychic dissonance that twisted and rebuffed the energies they relied upon so heavily. Khorne's minions, the embodiment of pure martial bloodlust, snarled and bared their weapons, yet their attacks were hesitant, their usual ferocity blunted by an instinctive recognition that this adversary could not be engaged with conventional rage. Their war cries faltered mid-shout, replaced by a growing uncertainty that spread through the ranks like a contagion. Even as they prepared to charge, the ground beneath their feet seemed to resist them, subtly shifting, vibrating, and rebounding with each step of the crimson figure. It was as though the very battlefield conspired against them, reshaping its contours to favor the newcomer, disorienting the Daemons and robbing them of their normally uncanny coordination. The Slaaneshi horrors, normally fluid, seductive, and overwhelmingly agile, found their usual grace disrupted. Every movement felt heavier, slower, as if some invisible force was dampening their agility, suppressing the psychic resonance that fueled their unnatural speed and reflexes. They paused mid-dance, tilting unnaturally as if the air itself were pushing against them. Their keen senses, attuned to chaos and the subtle manipulations of the warp, now experienced a discordant interference. It was a sensation unlike anything they had encountered, an unyielding presence that radiated not only power, but a fundamental defiance of their very nature. Nurgle's diseased creations, normally indifferent to harm and reveling in the spread of pestilence, experienced a different form of disruption. Their bodies, malformed and resilient, quivered as the crimson figure approached, as if the sheer intensity of his being resonated against the corruptive energies that usually sustained them. Some of the most grotesque forms wavered in place, unable to advance. The putrid stench of disease that normally announced their presence now seemed muted, repelled by an almost magnetic force that radiated outward from the figure, altering the immediate environment on both physical and psychic levels. Their allegiance to chaos was tested, not by loyalty, but by the overwhelming sense that this new entity could render all their efforts meaningless in an instant. Tzeentchian horrors, creatures of cunning and manipulation, paused, as if trying to recalculate the parameters of reality itself. Their multiple eyes darted, scanning for patterns, for openings, for strategies to exploit,
Yet the more they analyzed, the less comprehensible the situation became. Probability, causality, and foresight, the tools they wielded to anticipate and manipulate outcomes, faltered in the presence of this figure. The threads of the future, which they normally plucked and twisted to their advantage, now seemed to knot and unravel unpredictably, offering no clarity. Confusion, a rare vulnerability for beings so attuned to change, began to take hold, spreading among them in whispers of uncertainty that echoed across the battlefield. The Crimson Figure did not need to strike. His presence alone sent waves of destabilization through the ranks of the demonic horde. Every twitch, step, and shift radiated an intensity that was both physical and psychic, a duality that the Daemons could neither attack nor evade. Their senses screamed that this was no ordinary combatant, no mere mortal or creature of the material plane. This was an anomaly, a force whose very existence challenged the rules imposed by the Chaos Gods themselves. They recoiled, subtle movements betraying their instinctive recognition that the usual methods of intimidation, corruption, or overwhelming force would be ineffective here. The battlefield became a theater of hesitation. Daemons that had once surged in waves of coordinated slaughter now moved cautiously, checking each step, each attack, as though anticipating a counterstrike that could annihilate them before contact. Their normally chaotic energy, that unrelenting drive towards destruction, was siphoned into uncertainty, giving soldiers of the Imperium who had long struggled against these entities a brief, disorienting advantage. Even as Psychers strained to stabilize the warp in response, the Crimson Figure's aura made it difficult to channel energies coherently. Spells and psychic attacks wavered in effectiveness, their power distorted and partially deflected by the overwhelming force he radiated. The Daemon's hesitation was also psychological. The creatures, born of raw emotion and warp energy, rely heavily on the dominance hierarchy imposed by fear and strength. The Crimson Figure radiated a confidence and intensity that could not be challenged through conventional means, a power that the Daemons instinctively understood as superior. Leaders of Daemon contingents, normally assertive and commanding, faltered, their orders questioned subconsciously by the entities under their control. Coordination broke down as individuals reacted more to the overwhelming presence than to the tactical situation, creating gaps and weaknesses that would have been unimaginable under normal circumstances. Even the most fanatical and corrupted mortals on the field sensed the disruption. Their chants and rituals faltered. Magic faltered mid-incantation, and the psychic resonance that bound them to their patrons faltered. The Crimson Figure acted as a counterweight to their devotion, a focal point of power that siphoned attention and distorted intention. Some cultists instinctively lowered their weapons, stepping back from the battlefield despite their fanaticism, as though the very essence of this figure demanded recognition before any further action could be taken. The air itself seemed to warp around the demonic horde. Gusts of wind, punctuated by bursts of static energy, shifted unpredictably, carrying with them a tension that vibrated in the bones of all present. The ground quaked in response to the figure's steps, fissures opening and closing in time with his movement, disorienting even the most physically resilient Daemons. Smoke, ash, and debris swirled unnaturally, forming pockets of distorted space where attacks could be misdirected or neutralized before they even reached their intended targets. Every creature that relied on the warp for guidance, for energy, or for instinctual aggression now found themselves second-guessing movements that had been automatic for eons. The hesitation spread contagiously, as one faltering step prompted another, until the battlefield became a tense tableau where Daemons paused, unsettled and uncertain. The Crimson Figure advanced slowly, deliberately. Each movement, a silent assertion of dominance that resonated through both the material and immaterial planes. Their hesitation, though subtle at first, grew into a pronounced and undeniable phenomenon, leaving the horde momentarily impotent in the face of a being whose very existence challenged the natural order they long exploited.
Space Marines, the most disciplined and battle-hardened warriors of the Imperium, found themselves facing an unprecedented uncertainty as the Crimson Figure approached. Their training, honed over centuries of brutal campaigns, had prepared them for countless horrors, tyrannid swarms that devoured worlds, demonic incursions that warped reality, and heretical uprisings that threatened entire star systems. Yet none of these experiences seemed relevant in the face of this new adversary. The figure moved with a deliberate, controlled intensity that radiated not just physical power, but an almost palpable psychic dominance, something that even the most experienced veterans could instinctively recognize as a threat beyond mere combat skill. Bolter barrels were raised, chainswords gripped tightly, and power fists flexed, yet a subtle hesitation spread through the ranks, a rare and unnerving pause that betrayed a shared internal acknowledgement. Conventional tactics might not suffice. Commanders barked orders, their voices echoing over the din of distant artillery and explosions. Hold formation, fire at will, do not engage directly. Yet even these commands faltered as the soldiers' instinctive hesitation became apparent. Tactical maneuvers that would normally be executed without question were delayed, coordination breaking down under the strain of an overwhelming presence. Some veterans adjusted stances repeatedly, eyes darting, scanning for weaknesses that did not exist. Others muttered prayers under their breath, invoking the Emperor's guidance to steady nerves, shaken in ways no battlefield had previously induced. The normally unshakable sense of discipline characteristic of Astartes formations wavered, not in panic, but in careful, subconscious calculation, a recognition that survival might require unconventional thinking beyond their extensive training. The approach of the crimson figure introduced a psychic tension that spread beyond mere fear. Psychers embedded within the Space Marine squads felt a distortion in their ability to sense the warp, a fluctuation that made even minor predictions of enemy movement unreliable. The Immaterium itself seemed to respond to the figure, undulating violently, as though recoiling or bending around his presence. Lightning-like bursts of raw energy flickered at the edges of perception, and brief, terrifying visions assaulted the minds of those attuned to psychic currents. Even Space Marine librarians, trained to navigate the hazardous folds of the warp, felt the familiar laws of causality and probability bend around this intruder, leaving their carefully honed calculations uncertain and incomplete. The soldiers at the front lines, the ones whose eyes met the crimson figure directly, experienced a combination of awe and calculated fear. Their instincts, built over decades of combat and genetically reinforced through gene seed modifications, screamed both for aggression and caution. They understood that their weapons could inflict damage, but they also sensed that the figure's sheer presence might render standard tactics irrelevant. Bolters and plasma rifles were readied, but hesitation hung like a tangible weight over every trigger finger. Even the act of raising weapons felt secondary to the overwhelming impression of power conveyed in each measured step of the approaching adversary. Every action on the battlefield seemed to slow in response to the figure's advance. Titans that stomped across the plains adjusted their gait, stabilizers straining to compensate for an unpredictable gravitational pulse emanating from his massive form. Heavy artillery operators recalibrated firing solutions repeatedly, their sensors reporting data that conflicted with observed effects, as if reality itself had begun to bend in anticipation of his actions. Tactical decisions, normally executed with precision, faltered, caught between instinctive training and the realization that the parameters of engagement had shifted entirely. Soldiers instinctively spread out, formation lines stretched and contracted, yet each adjustment was tentative, as if even small miscalculations could result in catastrophic consequences.
Psychers among the Astartes could sense the underlying currents of power flowing outward from the figure. It was not merely a projection of strength, but a distortion of energy itself, a localized turbulence in the psychic spectrum that interfered with the usual balance of power. Even the most disciplined minds felt this disruption, an intrusive presence in their thoughts that eroded confidence and amplified caution. Attempts to anticipate the figure's next movement were thwarted by a subtle, almost imperceptible warping of perceived reality, as though he existed slightly out of phase with the conventional world, capable of observing, calculating, and adjusting with instantaneous precision. The battlefield environment itself responded in subtle ways. Ground tremors radiated outward from each step, unbalancing unprepared troops and making footing uncertain. Smoke and debris swirled unpredictably, obscuring lines of sight and creating fleeting pockets of danger that could trap even the most seasoned warriors. The air carried an almost tangible pressure, pressing against armor and shielding alike, reminding every soldier that their surroundings were no longer entirely under the control of conventional laws. Tactical formations that had been drilled to perfection now felt inadequate, and adjustments had to be made in real time, with every decision weighed against the unspoken understanding that this was no ordinary adversary. Even the highest-ranking officers within the Space Marine contingents recognized the shift in momentum. They had encountered Daemons that could warp reality, alien species that outnumbered and outgunned them, and weapons capable of annihilating entire regiments in a single strike. Yet the Crimson figure presented a challenge that transcended conventional command structures. Strategic considerations were overshadowed by the immediate need to adapt, improvise, and maintain cohesion under circumstances that no manual could have prepared them for. Orders were issued more cautiously, movements executed more deliberately, and every action taken was measured against the silent, overpowering force that loomed ever closer. The hesitation of the Space Marines was not panic, but a profound awareness of the stakes involved. They were trained to confront impossible odds, yet the figure's presence introduced an uncertainty that forced them to question even the most basic assumptions. Tactical engagement, advance, retreat, or flanking maneuvers, every option was filtered through a lens of careful analysis, tempered by instinctive recognition of the figure's potential to disrupt conventional expectations. Even as weapon systems were readied and psychic wards activated, the soldiers' minds remained occupied with the subtle realization that they were facing a force that might redefine the parameters of the battle entirely. In this frozen moment of anticipation, the battlefield became a tableau of tense readiness. Space Marines stood shoulder to shoulder, disciplined and armored, yet their movements were measured, cautious, and deliberate. Every gesture, from a raised bolt gun to a flexed gauntlet, reflected an internal negotiation between instinct and rational calculation. They were fully aware of the immense threat posed by the Crimson figure, and that awareness permeated every aspect of their being, influencing posture, focus, and decision-making. Even those trained to embody courage without hesitation found themselves confronting an existential challenge that demanded more than mere bravery.
Entire planets trembled at his first strike, a force so immense that the ground itself seemed to scream under the pressure of his arrival. The impact reverberated across the planetary crust, sending fissures spreading like veins of molten energy through mountains and valleys alike. Forests, already scarred by prior conflicts, were flattened in vast swaths. Trees snapped as if they were mere twigs, their leaves and branches shredded into the turbulent winds that followed the initial shockwave. Cities that had once been bastions of imperial power crumbled instantly under the sheer kinetic force. Stone and metal pulverized and sent flying in every direction, igniting fires that consumed entire districts within minutes. The first strike was not a mere demonstration of strength. It was a planetary event, a cataclysm that the inhabitants could feel in every tremor beneath their feet, in every shudder of the ground beneath the weight of the massive Crimson figure. The oceans themselves responded violently, the initial shockwave traveling through tectonic plates and across seas. Coastal cities were inundated as water surged inland in massive waves, carrying debris and wreckage, sweeping away what little resistance might have remained. Submarine installations shuttered, and deep-sea mining operations collapsed as the vibrations reverberated through the ocean floor.
Even the atmospheres reacted to the sudden, concentrated energy release. Winds shifted violently, storms forming in moments that rivaled centuries of natural weather patterns. Lightning ripped across the sky, striking indiscriminately, igniting fires in areas untouched by the initial shockwave, and creating a cascading chain reaction of destruction that seemed almost sentient in its precision and scope. The soldiers stationed on the planet, from the most elite Space Marine squads to the Imperial Guard conscripts, felt the tremor in their very bones. Even armored vehicles and towering war machines could not compensate for the suddenness and magnitude of the strike. Titans teetered on unstable ground, their stabilizers straining to compensate for the seismic assault, while smaller vehicles were flung off roads, colliding with one another in a cacophony of metal grinding against metal. Bolters fired, engines roared, and artillery shells detonated in midair. Yet all these efforts seemed inconsequential against the enormity of the energy that had been unleashed. Soldiers struggled to maintain footing, shouting over the roar of collapsing structures and screaming civilians, their training insufficient against the sudden, overwhelming power that radiated outward from a single source. Even the planet's crust began to fracture visibly, enormous cracks opening like jagged scars across the landscape. Volcanoes, previously dormant for millennia, awakened with violent eruptions, spewing lava and ash into the atmosphere and adding another layer of chaos to the already catastrophic scene. Mountain ranges buckled, rock slides cascading down slopes with unstoppable force, burying forests, villages, and any advancing forces beneath tons of debris. The seismic activity was not localized. It propagated across the entire planet, shaking continents in a manner that seemed to respond directly to the figure's movements. Sensors placed in orbit or on distant moon bases recorded gravitational anomalies and planetary oscillations of a magnitude previously considered impossible for a single being to induce.
Civilian populations, caught in the midst of this planetary upheaval, experienced the horror in its most immediate and visceral form. Entire cities were obliterated, buildings reduced to rubble in moments, and the screams of those trapped under debris filled the air. Roads split open, vehicles hurled into the air by sudden quakes, and bridges collapsed, leaving thousands stranded or crushed under the weight of falling stone. Emergency response units attempted evacuation and aid, but their efforts were hindered by the unpredictable spread of destruction and the sheer scale of devastation. Panic spread like wildfire, amplified by the impossibility of comprehending the source of such overwhelming force. The atmosphere itself became turbulent in response to the first strike. Winds howled with a velocity capable of uprooting entire forests, carrying debris across kilometers, turning even minor projectiles into deadly missiles. Dust, ash, and smoke combined to form a choking haze, reducing visibility to near zero in many regions, complicating rescue efforts and military responses alike. Electrical storms erupted spontaneously, triggered by the sudden shifts in atmospheric pressure and the discharge of energy from the planet's surface. Lightning struck with indiscriminate ferocity, igniting secondary fires and adding an unpredictable layer of danger to an already chaotic battlefield. The first strike also sent shockwaves through the local warp currents, creating psychic disturbances that affected psychers, cultists, and demonic entities alike. Those sensitive to the Immaterium felt sudden, violent tremors in their psychic perceptions, waves of energy that disrupted spells, rituals, and warp-fueled attacks. Even Daemons, typically fearless and unrelenting, paused instinctively, as if recognizing a force capable of defying the influence of their patrons. The warp itself seemed to ripple and recoil, an almost sentient reaction to the overwhelming concentration of power radiating from a single point of origin. This created an eerie, disorienting effect for all sentient beings on the planet, as the boundaries between reality and psychic distortion blurred in unpredictable ways. Military command centers struggled to respond to the magnitude of the strike. Strategic planning, normally conducted under strict protocols and hierarchies, became irrelevant as communications were disrupted by seismic disturbances and electrical interference. Orders issued to troops and vehicles were delayed, garbled, or ignored entirely as the sheer intensity of the event overwhelmed the conventional mechanisms of control. Even the most disciplined officers, trained to maintain composure under extreme stress, found themselves adapting on the fly, making instantaneous judgments in a scenario for which no manual or prior experience could provide guidance. The immediate vicinity of the strike became a scene of utter devastation. Entire districts of urban centers were leveled within seconds, their remains reduced to smoldering rubble. Industrial complexes, power plants, and munitions depots were obliterated, sending secondary explosions into the surrounding area, further amplifying the destruction. Forests surrounding urban zones were stripped bare, wildlife obliterated in moments, and the landscape left scarred and unrecognizable. Smoke and fire spread rapidly, carried by strong winds, and a dense, choking haze obscured the horizon, making it nearly impossible to distinguish between battlefield and wasteland. Even orbital forces stationed above the planet were not immune to the consequences of the strike. Satellites and defensive platforms experienced sudden gravitational fluctuations, their orbits shifting slightly, while targeting systems and sensors detected anomalous energy readings that defied classification. Ships hovering in low orbit felt minor tremors transmitted through gravitic and inertial sensors, a reminder that the magnitude of the figure's power extended far beyond the surface itself. Reports from these platforms detailed the terrifying visual spectacle of entire regions of the planet shuddering simultaneously, the combined effects of kinetic force, seismic upheaval, and atmospheric turbulence presenting a scenario of absolute planetary instability.
Titans clashed on the battlefield, their enormous forms shaking the ground with every step, their weapons discharging volleys capable of leveling city blocks. Yet the Crimson figure moved through the chaos with an unsettling, almost casual dominance. Each step he took seemed to reverberate through the battlefield, a rhythm that both disrupted and intimidated, forcing even the most colossal war machines to hesitate or readjust their footing. The Titans, these massive war engines designed to embody the pinnacle of human ingenuity and firepower, unleashed torrents of plasma, missiles, and high-yield ordnance. Yet each attack appeared almost inconsequential, striking against the Crimson form and producing minimal effect. Sparks flew, armor plates buckled under the force of their own recoil, but the figure remained unmoved, an immovable presence amidst a symphony of destruction. The battle was not merely physical, it was an intricate interplay of scale, energy, and psychology. Each Titan pilot, trained to operate within strict protocols under extreme duress, found themselves reevaluating every tactical decision in real time. The battlefield was no longer just a matter of targeting weak points or coordinating fire with other units. The presence of the figure demanded that every strategy be reconsidered. Traditional formations, staggered advances, and suppressive fire techniques all faltered under the psychic weight radiating outward. The colossal humanoid, while not wielding weapons in the traditional sense, exuded a kinetic and psychic influence that reshaped the engagement entirely. Every Titan movement was met with instinctive calculations by the Crimson figure. He did not strike indiscriminately. Each shift of his massive form was deliberate, precise, and imbued with an understanding of both machine and environment. When a Titan raised its massive chainsword or laser cannon, the figure sidestepped with a grace that defied his immense size, letting the weapon slash through empty space while the pilot's mind raced to recalibrate targeting and defensive measures. Plasma bolts streaked through the air, explosive shells detonated near him, yet each attack appeared almost inconsequential, striking against the Crimson form and producing minimal effect.
Sparks flew, armor plates buckled under the force of their own recoil, but the figure remained unmoved, an immovable presence amidst a symphony of destruction. The ground itself responded to the interaction between Titans and the figure. Tremors rippled outward from each of his movements, colliding with the shocks from the Titan's heavy footfalls and ordnance impacts, producing unpredictable waves that buckled terrain and threw infantry into disarray. Buildings and fortifications already weakened by prior engagements crumbled under the combined stresses, sending rubble tumbling down onto nearby troops. Smoke, dust, and fire combined to form a dense, oppressive haze that distorted visibility, forcing gunners to rely on instinctive targeting and scanners strained beyond their design. Even the most advanced targeting systems of the Titans struggled to maintain lock-on, as the figure's movements created subtle distortions in space and gravity that interfered with sensors and predictive algorithms. Infantry units scattered across the battlefield observed the class with a mixture of awe and terror. These soldiers, accustomed to facing overwhelmingly large threats, understood the scale of Titans and their destructive potential, yet watching the Crimson figure move through their ranks and the Titans' firepower left them unsettled. Orders from commanders were hesitant, wavering, as if even the highest-ranking officers recognized that conventional battle plans were insufficient. Veterans tried to steady their squads, but the tension was palpable. The battlefield's focus had shifted from strategy to survival, each individual measuring every step and every breath against the unpredictable force in front of them.
The figure's presence also influenced the Titans' internal systems. Feedback from their servo motors, gravitic stabilizers, and weapon targeting arrays fluctuated unpredictably, as if the environment itself was resisting their technological dominance. Pilots felt the strain in their neural links, their synapses firing to compensate for shifts that were difficult to predict. The battlefield's very geometry seemed to bend around the Crimson figure, creating angles and trajectories that confounded targeting software and forced constant human adjustment. In these moments, even the most confident Titan pilots recognized the futility of relying solely on mechanical superiority. Chaos-aligned forces, both demonic and mortal, attempted to capitalize on the Titan's presence, striking at exposed points or attempting to coordinate attacks with their own war machines. Yet the figure's awareness and timing nullified their efforts as effectively as he deflected the Titan's ordnance. Demonic lances struck and fizzled against his energy field-like aura, and corrupted vehicles expecting advantage were thrown off course by shockwaves and concussive force generated merely by his motion. This was not just raw power, it was controlled, strategic, and impossible to counter through conventional means, turning coordinated attacks into chaotic, misaligned strikes that often harmed allies as much as intended targets. The physicality of the figure was staggering. Muscles, coiled and dense, moved with a precision that belied their bulk, each step generating concussive force capable of destabilizing even the heaviest constructs. Titans, though towering and heavily armored, rocked with each proximity, their massive feet skidding slightly on destabilized ground. Weapons aimed directly at him were nearly futile. Laser cannons sizzled against his skin without penetration. Chain weapons ground into empty air, and missile barrages detonated harmlessly, sending shockwaves outward but failing to inflict meaningful damage. He seemed almost to absorb the energy around him, redirecting it through the battlefield and turning mechanical might into a stage for his dominance rather than an effective countermeasure. The interplay of firepower, size, and raw strength created a chaotic ballet across the plains. Titans collided with debris, their armor groaning under stress, while artillery shells detonated unpredictably as the battlefield's topography shifted under his influence. Infantry scrambled through dust-choked air, desperately seeking cover from the combined force of kinetic shockwaves and debris. He moved through it all with a confidence that was almost casual,
Each stride a calculated assertion of superiority, each glance a reminder that even the most powerful human constructs were secondary in the presence of his overwhelming might. Communication lines within Titan units began to falter. Pilots shouted orders to coordinate fire, but neural feedback and environmental interference caused delays and misinterpretations. Targeting computers recalculated endlessly, grappling with the unpredictable vectors generated by his presence. Even formations designed for synchronized assaults became disjointed, as Titans attempted to adjust individually rather than as a cohesive unit. This fragmentation played directly into his advantage, allowing him to manipulate the battlefield without engaging in traditional combat. Observing the clash from a distance, commanders and psychers alike understood that the crimson figure represented an entirely new level of threat. It was not merely his ability to withstand firepower. It was his awareness, his timing, and the way he altered the battlefield itself. Titans, symbols of human technological supremacy, were challenged not just in combat, but in their very existence. Forced to react, adapt, and struggle against a force that refused to conform to conventional expectations. The psychological impact on both allies and enemies was profound, creating hesitation, uncertainty, and a creeping dread that permeated every layer of the battlefield.
The air above the battlefield shimmered with a tense, almost electric charge as orbital bombardments began. Massive void ships unleashing torrents of plasma, macro cannons, and missile salvos in an attempt to subdue the crimson figure from above. From orbit, the scale of the destruction already wrought on the planet's surface was immediately apparent. Entire cities had been flattened, rivers of fire and molten debris snaking across plains, and terrain ripped apart in vast chasms radiating outward from his initial strikes. Sensor arrays struggled to maintain tracking as each step of the figure produced tremors that interfered with gravimetric and inertial readings, distorting the information fed to the command centers. Even the most sophisticated targeting algorithms of the Imperium's void ships had difficulty compensating for the unpredictable forces at play, making precision strikes nearly impossible. When plasma bolts and orbital lances struck the crimson figure, the impacts were dramatic, yet astonishingly ineffective. Energy arced and flared around him, but his form absorbed and dissipated the attacks with minimal apparent harm. Shockwaves from the explosions radiated outward, tearing through nearby terrain, hurling debris across the battlefield, and impacting troops and vehicles alike. Even as the void ships concentrated fire, attempting to saturate the area with overwhelming energy, the figure advanced unimpeded, each movement calculated and deliberate. His awareness extended beyond the immediate ground, detecting incoming orbital strikes and adjusting position with uncanny foresight, sidestepping death as if it were an intangible concept rather than a genuine threat. The psychological impact of the orbital bombardment on both allies and enemies was profound. Imperial commanders, accustomed to projecting devastating force from orbit, were forced to acknowledge the futility of conventional bombardment against this entity. Soldiers on the surface, already grappling with the shock of his presence, witnessed torrents of fire raining down on him and yet failing to even slow his advance. This duality, destruction all around yet minimal impact upon the figure himself, created a sense of cognitive dissonance, undermining morale and instilling a subtle but undeniable fear that transcended mere survival instinct. Ground forces attempted to capitalize on the chaos created by orbital strikes. Lemon Rust tanks fired in synchrony with the bursts from above,
Artillery pieces sought to hit with calculated timing, and squads of infantry advanced through smoke-choked terrain. Yet each offensive maneuver met the same pattern. The figure shifted his massive form in response, each step altering the battlefield's geometry, destabilizing artillery imposements and throwing off targeting solutions. Bolters and lasguns spat fire with relentless determination, but even coordinated volleys seemed like small irritants against an adversary who moved with the confidence of someone unconcerned by conventional weapons. The battlefield was no longer defined by traditional measures of firepower, but by an interplay of presence, anticipation, and raw force. Psykers on both sides struggled to maintain their control over the warp under the influence of this extraordinary entity. The Crimson figure's psychic resonance, subtle yet overpowering, interfered with telepathy, divination, and offensive psychic attacks. Spells faltered mid-incantation, ritual circles cracked under the stress of psychic turbulence, and demonic manifestations occasionally faltered as if the warp itself had been distorted by his presence. Even the most powerful librarians found themselves recalibrating constantly, attempting to anticipate the subtle feedback loops created by the interaction of his aura with the surrounding psychic environment. Their focus was not merely on offense or defense, it was survival in a space where reality itself seemed to bend around his will. The terrain, already scarred by prior destruction, became a chaotic labyrinth under the simultaneous pressures of orbital fire and the figure's movement. Craters from impact detonations destabilized ground for advancing vehicles and infantry alike. Rivers of molten debris flowed unpredictably, igniting fires and creating natural barriers that forced troops to divert, often into positions of disadvantage. Hills collapsed under concussive waves, and forests that survived initial strikes were shredded by the combination of shockwaves and wind currents generated by both firepower and the figure's steps. In this constantly shifting environment, even the most disciplined formations struggled to maintain cohesion, turning tactical maneuvers into improvisation under extreme stress.
The orbital bombardment created visual and auditory chaos that further disoriented both troops and daemons. Explosions tore through the air with deafening intensity, concussive waves shaking the battlefield and rattling armored units. Firestorms erupted unpredictably, consuming previously stable terrain and forcing units to navigate through smoke, flame, and flying debris. Shadows cast by debris and rolling smoke created fleeting illusions, causing soldiers to mistake movement or absence for attacks or reinforcements. Each sensory input added layers of cognitive strain, amplifying the already profound psychological effect of witnessing a being seemingly untouched by overwhelming force. From orbit, the void ship crews witnessed the figure's interaction with the bombardment firsthand. Targeting feeds showed plasma lances splintering against his form, macro cannons producing eruptions of dust and rubble with little discernible effect, and missile salvos detonating around him while leaving his stride uninterrupted. Pilots and gunner crews, trained to rely on precision calculations, began second-guessing firing solutions, attempting to compensate for the unpredictable influence of his mass and presence. Even automated targeting sequences were disrupted, producing erratic fire patterns that inadvertently threatened Allied positions on the surface. The disparity between expectation and outcome generated tension among the command staff, a creeping realization that conventional orbital dominance might be insufficient. Daemon forces sensitive to psychic resonance also responded to the bombardment in ways that reflected their discomfort. Those that had previously been confident in their assault faltered as the combination of psychic feedback and kinetic disturbances created unpredictable patterns in the warp. Slaaneshi entities twitched unnaturally, Khorne berserkers hesitated mid-charge, and Tzeentchian horrors attempted to recalibrate schemes that suddenly no longer align with observed reality. Even Nurgle's creations, typically impervious to disruption, recoiled instinctively as the combined energy from above and the figure's own aura collided, creating zones of instability where movement became hazardous and aggression less effective. As the figure continued his advance under orbital fire, the battlefield became a crucible of competing forces. Kinetic energy from explosions collided with psychic distortions, displacing infantry and vehicles while simultaneously warping perceptions. Artillery shells detonated mid-air as shockwaves and heat interacted unpredictably with environmental conditions. The Crimson figure seemed to anticipate each disruption, using it to his advantage by altering the battlefield subtly yet decisively, turning potential hazards into protective barriers or channels for counteraction. His presence transformed conventional strategies into exercises in futility, forcing both sides to adapt in real time, often without the benefit of reliable data or predictable outcomes. Even in areas far from the immediate strike zone, soldiers and psychers felt the reverberations of orbital bombardment combined with the figure's movements. Buildings shuddered, sensors fluctuated, and morale wavered as word spread of the figure's ability to endure overwhelming firepower without injury. Panic and hesitation spread subtly through ranks, with units unsure whether to advance, hold position, or retreat. Leadership, both on the ground and in orbit, had to continuously reassess the unfolding situation, balancing aggression with caution and improvising strategies under conditions that violated every prior understanding of warfare and battlefield physics.
The Imperium's psychers, trained over decades to channel the Immaterium with precision, felt a disruption unlike any they had previously encountered as the Crimson figure advanced. Normally, the warp could be navigated through rigorous training, mental discipline, and careful attunement to the currents of psychic energy. Spells were calculated, divinations precise, and psychic attacks launched with an understanding of the delicate balance between energy input and the expected output. Yet the moment this massive crimson presence entered their field of perception, that balance shattered. The figure emitted a psychic signature that seems to warp the surrounding Immaterium, bending energy flows in unpredictable ways, creating feedback loops that interfered with both offensive and defensive psychic abilities. Even minor attempts to manipulate the warp produced unintended effects, as the environment itself resisted standard methods of control, amplifying risk and uncertainty. As demonic entities surged forward, drawn by the scent of conflict and the psychic turbulence of war, they too experienced a profound destabilization. Khorne's berserkers, driven purely by martial bloodlust, found their aggression blunted by the overwhelming force radiating from the figure. Their movements became hesitant, attacks slightly miscalculated, and coordination within squads faltered. Slaaneshi horrors, whose beauty and speed often gave them a natural advantage in both deception and lethality, were slowed almost imperceptibly, their reflexes disrupted by subtle distortions in the psychic and physical environments. Zerchentian schemers, accustomed to bending probability and manipulating outcomes, found their calculations confounded as the figure advanced, each step seeming to disrupt the intricate web of causality that they relied upon. Nurgle's minions, typically impervious to pain and disorder, hesitated, sensing a pressure in the atmosphere that interfered with their innate resilience. It was as if the figure's mere presence acted as a universal counterweight to chaos itself, neutralizing instinct and rendering aggressive tactics unreliable. The battlefield became a theater of disorientation.
Explosions, gunfire, and energy discharges occurred constantly, yet the figure moved almost effortlessly through the chaos. Shockwaves from his footsteps interacted with the terrain in unpredictable ways, destabilizing ground, toppling structures, and altering the trajectories of projectiles mid-flight. Tanks and mechanized units struggled to maintain balance as seismic vibrations propagated through their stabilizers, forcing pilots to compensate for minute shifts while simultaneously reacting to the advancing figure. Infantry units, accustomed to operating under extreme duress, found themselves navigating a landscape that seemed to resist all attempts at conventional movement. Every step had to be measured, every decision recalibrated against a backdrop of uncertainty amplified by the figure's presence. Energy weapons and conventional firearms fired with relentless intensity, yet the figure absorbed or deflected them with minimal apparent effort. Plasma bolts sizzled against his form, producing bursts of vaporized energy that scattered debris in all directions. Bolter fire ricocheted harmlessly, and las cannons, even when hitting near the target, seemed to cause nothing more than a shockwave that reinforced his imposing presence. Each attack served to illustrate his dominance, not through direct defense, but through the futility it inspired in those attempting to harm him. Soldiers could feel the weight of inevitability, an almost tangible sense that conventional weapons would achieve little, creating hesitation, doubt, and a gnawing awareness of their own limitations. Demonic strategies that relied on exploiting confusion or fear were neutralized by the figure's overwhelming aura. Khorne's minions, whose instinctual understanding of violence made them predictable, found themselves unable to leverage their typical aggression. Slaaneshi horrors' manipulations of perception became unreliable as distortions in the environment interfered with their normally flawless deception. Tzeentchian plots, reliant on foresight and probability manipulation, faltered as the figure's presence created chaotic anomalies that rendered calculations moot. Even Nurgle's persistence and resilience seemed compromised under the pressure of a being whose power radiated across both physical and psychic planes. The battlefield, once predictable to these entities, now operated under a new and unknowable set of rules imposed by the figure. The interaction of physical and psychic forces amplified the impact of every step the figure took. Seismic tremors propagated across the ground, colliding with environmental hazards, weapon fire, and psychic disturbances in unpredictable ways. Craters formed, debris was sent flying, and even armored units found themselves destabilized as the battlefield shifted beneath them. Soldiers attempted to take cover, yet the constant recalibration of the terrain made shelter unreliable, forcing them to rely on instinct and improvisation rather than training. Each moment was filled with the tension of anticipating not just the figure's actions, but the chaotic secondary effects of his movement, creating a feedback loop of uncertainty and adaptation. The presence of this entity also challenged the fundamental assumptions of military doctrine. Combined arms tactics, which relied on predictable interactions between infantry, vehicles, and artillery, were rendered ineffective. Coordination between psychic, physical, and mechanical units became fraught with instability. Even specialized units trained to counter superhuman threats found their standard engagement protocols inadequate, as every variable they relied upon, terrain, enemy behavior, psychic readings, was constantly distorted by the figure's advance. Commanders had to innovate in real time, often abandoning pre-planned strategies entirely, forced to react to conditions that, in effect, were continuously rewritten by the figure's advance. Environmental effects further compounded the challenge. Fires from prior bombardments spread unpredictably. Smoke and ash reduced visibility, and wind currents generated by the combination of explosions and shockwaves shifted unpredictably. Rivers of molten debris obstructed paths, and collapsed structures created hazardous zones where movement was perilous. Even areas previously considered safe were compromised by the cascading effects of terrain destabilization and psychic turbulence. The battlefield became a living, reactive environment shaped as much by the figure's presence as by any conscious strategy of the forces engaged. Infantry morale was tested continuously. Witnessing the figure endure overwhelming assaults and traverse devastation effortlessly created both awe and terror. Soldiers hesitated before acting, their instincts at odds with their training, creating gaps in formations and missed opportunities. Veterans, whose confidence in the Emperor's guidance had never wavered, found themselves forced to confront a new type of threat, one that challenged the very notions of power, resilience, and survival. Every engagement became a test of perception and reaction, as the conventional rules of combat no longer applied in a scenario dominated by a single, unparalleled presence. The battlefield transformed into a chaotic nexus of violence, strategy, and raw power as the Crimson figure pressed onward, his presence fundamentally altering every facet of the engagement. What was once a conventional theater of war, defined by formations, tactics, and predictable outcomes, became a dynamic crucible in which every decision, every movement, and every weapon discharge was reframed under the shadow of an overwhelming singular force. Soldiers, both human and alien, found their instincts stretched to the limit, their training tested against a reality in which standard rules of engagement no longer applied. Infantry formations that had been meticulously drilled for decades faltered as the figure advanced, not out of fear alone, but because the battlefield itself seemed to shift subtly, reacting to each step he took. Ground that had been stable moments before quaked under his presence, creating fissures, shifting debris, and unpredictable hazards that forced even the most disciplined units to recalibrate in real time. The figure's movement had a dual effect, physically displacing forces and psychologically dominating the minds of those who observed him. Imperial Guard troops, long accustomed to the sight of monstrous Daemons and Xenos of immense scale, hesitated as they watched the figure stride through the battlefield as if untouched by the torrent of destruction around him. Bolters were raised, chainswords primed, but the instinctive hesitation that rippled through the ranks reflected a subconscious acknowledgement that conventional force would likely fail. Veteran squads attempted to steady themselves, forming lines and attempting tactical maneuvers, but subtle distortions in terrain and perception forced constant adjustments. Every minor misstep risked catastrophic consequences as terrain destabilized under his presence, artillery blasts veered off course, and psychic energy in the surrounding area fluctuated unpredictably. Demonic entities, normally aggressive and relentless, found themselves disrupted in ways they had never encountered. Khorne's minions, whose fury usually made them almost unstoppable, slowed their charge as if an invisible barrier interfered with the natural rhythm of their aggression. Slaaneshi horrors, accustomed to manipulating both perception and sensation to confuse their opponents, twitched unnaturally, unable to predict or influence outcomes reliably. Tzeentchian horrors, typically masters of probability and foresight, faltered as the figure's presence seemed to twist causality, creating anomalies that nullified even the most carefully laid schemes. Even Nurgle's creations, normally indifferent to pain or chaos, hesitated instinctively, sensing that the immense pressure radiating from the figure could not be countered through conventional endurance. Across the battlefield, every demonic entity recalculated instinctively, attempting to navigate forces and psychic distortions beyond their normal comprehension. Space Marines, though genetically enhanced and trained to face the impossible, were not immune to the figure's disruptive aura.
Tactical squads attempted to coordinate precision strikes, utilizing bolters, plasma guns, and power weapons in concert with each other. Yet each attack seemed to collide with not only the figure's defenses, but also the unpredictable consequences of his influence on the environment. Titans, the Imperium's ultimate war machines, launched volleys of missiles and laser fire, yet each salvo required constant adjustment to account for seismic tremors, shockwaves, and the subtle manipulation of battlefield geometry emanating from the figure. Even the most advanced targeting algorithms struggled to maintain accuracy as trajectories shifted imperceptibly under the dual influence of kinetic force and psychic resonance.
Orbital forces, observing from above, were equally challenged. Void ships unleashed barrages meant to obliterate entire sectors, macro cannons and plasma lances converging on predicted points of impact, yet the figure's movements rendered precise strikes increasingly unreliable. Shockwaves from explosions collided with terrain and the figure's own kinetic output, producing unpredictable patterns of energy that destabilized nearby units and structures. Sensors fluctuated, data streams conflicted with visual observation, and targeting computers continuously recalibrated without ever achieving perfect accuracy. Pilots and gunners, trained to operate under extreme conditions, found their confidence tested by the anomaly of a being whose presence defied conventional physics and prediction. The combination of physical devastation and psychic interference created cascading effects across the battlefield. Seismic activity destabilized fortifications, trenches collapsed, and rivers of molten debris created natural obstacles that forced both attackers and defenders to adjust constantly. Fires ignited by prior bombardments spread unpredictably, consuming cover and forcing units to relocate into exposed areas. Smoke, ash, and debris filled the air, reducing visibility and complicating both targeting and movement. Even areas initially considered safe were transformed into hazards as the figure's influence radiated outward, interacting with environmental features in ways that amplified chaos rather than stabilizing it. Psykers experienced profound disruptions as they attempted to channel the Immaterium. Spells faltered mid-cast, psychic shields flickered unpredictably, and attempts to manipulate or influence the battlefield through psychic means were countered subtly by the figure's own aura. Even the most powerful librarians struggled to maintain focus, forced to compensate constantly for anomalies in psychic energy that rendered standard calculations unreliable. Demonic entities, sensitive to the fluctuations in the warp, reacted unpredictably, creating pockets of hesitation or aggression that could neither be anticipated nor controlled. The battlefield became a complex interplay of material and immaterial forces, a constantly shifting web in which traditional notions of cause and effect were warped by the figure's presence. Infantry morale was tested to the utmost limit. Watching the figure withstand and counteract overwhelming attacks created a mix of awe and terror. Soldiers found themselves second-guessing instinctive actions, questioning whether advancing or holding position would even make a difference. Leadership at every level struggled to maintain cohesion, as conventional orders often failed to account for the dynamic distortions introduced by the figure. Commanders issued instructions cautiously, aware that misjudgments could lead to disastrous outcomes. Coordination became improvisational, each unit adjusting reactively rather than proactively, a continuous dance of adaptation in which survival itself depended on perception and rapid recalibration. Even the logistical elements of the battlefield were affected. Supply lines were disrupted as terrain shifted unpredictably, transport vehicles became impeded by debris and unstable ground, and evacuation routes for civilians and wounded soldiers were compromised. Engineers and combat servitors attempted repairs and fortifications, yet the ground's instability and the constant shockwaves rendered most efforts temporary at best. Every operational plan had to be continuously revised in real time, as no area could be considered reliably stable or secure.
The cumulative effect of these phenomena transformed the battle into an arena dominated not by numbers, firepower, or even strategy, but by the overwhelming presence of the Crimson Figure. Every element, physical, psychic, technological, and psychological, was reframed in response to his influence. The battlefield itself became an extension of his will, shifting and reacting in ways that tested the skill, courage, and adaptability of every combatant. Soldiers, vehicles, demons, and psychers alike found themselves participating in a confrontation that defied all conventional rules, forced to navigate a reality subtly rewritten by a force whose very existence challenged the balance of power in the galaxy.